talk about the arthropods at a later date, I believe. And I have no idea what's happening in lab on Wednesday, except that I won't be there, so. I see him again, I'm going out of town. I'm going to the Diatom Symposium, North American Diatom Symposium on Wednesday. So if I see him before I leave, I will try to ask him to tell you what to expect in terms of clothing. Yeah, that's all. Burning questions? Okay. So we're just going to talk about a bunch of different groups of organisms, and so for a future test, this will probably be, I think, matching question. And just want you to be familiar with some of these lesser talked about things that are present in freshwater ecosystems, and some that cause disease, or others that may be invasive species, so just a variety of things. So, we'll start with the quote protozoa, which is just a junk pile, not a monophyletic group. So there's not one lineage that leads to all the protozoa and only protozoa. Protozoa is just a term for single-celled heterotrophic things. So that's all that is. So they are single-celled eukaryotes, and generally they are heterotrophic. But I have something green there, that's our friend Euglena, which also, I mean, it's an alga, it's protozoan. It's an alga, it's protozoan. So some things are kind of both. It's pretty weird there in the world of small things. But these are often modal organisms, so we'll talk about different methods of movement that you might see. And do you know what protozoa literally means? Like literally what it means?
Before animals?
First animals. So, but yeah, they're kind of the animal-like single-celled organisms. But they move, they're heterotrophs, and so that made them seem like small animals. But they're really like their own lineages. And like animals, they ingest particles, and it could be other organisms or just like chunks of organic goodness. They might just absorb carbon, dissolve organic carbon. And some of them might be predators on bacteria. And why do we care about that? Talked about viruses and bacteria. So the bacteria here would be not the cyanobacteria. Yeah. So generally, if we mean cyanobacteria, we call them cyanobacteria. If it's non-photosynthetic, they're the bacteria. Very segregated about that.
Could they be like, other than viruses, another way to manage population density bacteria?
Yeah, I mean, basically, can control bacteria. So what do bacteria do in ecosystems? That group I was going to talk about for the next couple of weeks.
Primary producer?
Not these bacteria, that would be the cyanobacteria. Nutrient cycles. So a lot of them are decomposers for one, and then also others are involved with some transformations in nutrient cycles. So anything that affects bacteria can affect a lot of other things as well. All right, so in the protozoans we have some separate groups, and we'll talk about the flagellates, which have, you guessed it, flagella. And they have at least one flagellum, and flagella. They may have more. Also not a good monophyletic group. So lots of branches on the tree of life that are what we call flagellates. And some folks might refer to flagellated algae as phytoflagellates, so like Euglena, which is flagellated single cell, they might call that a phytoflagellate. Algae people don't say that, so this would be like the protozoa people saying that. We can have zooflagellates that are heterotrophs and all of that. And then sometimes there are little teeny tiny flagellates that are called nanoflagellates. And also those can be really important consumers of bacteria, and they can also themselves be important in nutrient cycling. And then the one in the picture is a human parasite. Ever heard of Giardia?
Sounds familiar.
Or giardiasis? I'll write it down. So Giardia is the most common waterborne parasite in the U.S. And it's an intestinal parasite, and you get it by drinking contaminated water, basically. And so that's why you need to, or one of the many reasons why you need to, if you're out camping and there's a stream or a lake, you need to filter that water to get things like Giardia out of it. It's a weird cell. It's got, you can't really see it, but it's got kind of like a sucker spot on there, and it attaches to the inside of the small intestine, and that's where all your nutrients from food get absorbed, and so it's just like stealing all your nutrients. But when your immune system says, hey, there's some foreign object lodged into your intestinal wall, it says, let's get it out by moving everything as quickly as possible. And so that's what happens if you get Giardia. It can also insist in your body and then come back again. Like if you get stressed or get sick, it can come back. So this is an important parasite to have treated if you should be suspected of having it. So I've heard of people getting it from like mud splashed on the water bottle that was on their bike. Heard of that. My nieces got it at daycare when they were like 3 years old from some other kid that had it, because kids are filthy and gross. And so yeah, once a person has it, they can also pass it to other people. Also known as beaver fever, because if animals are pooping in a lake or a stream, then that would be the source of it. So anyway, so that's important. So those are just the term flagellates. We also have ciliates, which they are a good lineage. They have their own phylum, Coleoptera, so they are a good monophyletic group. And they have 4 or more cilia, which are basically really short flagella. And so they look like they're covered with little tiny hairs. Or they have a collection of tiny hairs in some way. And in freshwater, they can be swimming in the plankton, and we probably saw some on TV. Or they can be more benthic. So there's lots of diversity of these, and they feed on mostly bacteria or other protozoans, but they might also eat algae. So basically any cell that's the right size, they will feed on it. And do you remember looking at paramecium in 130 lab, maybe? Top one is paramecium. If you look closely, you might see all the little tiny hairs that covers the whole surface of the cell. And then they beat them in a coordinated way and use that to swim around. paramecium also has like almost like a mouth it's a gullet, just kind of a channel that's lined with cilia, and it kind of creates a current to bring particles inside so they can ingest them. This lower thing, these little dudes, Vorticella, they usually are kind of hanging out together, several of them. They'll have little crown of cilia on one end, and then they have these tails that are kind of springy, and so sometimes they like spring back down and then they shoot back out, and they're kind of fun to watch. But they're often stuck on some of our tectonic algae. But there's lots of different species of ciliates out there, and I think we saw a few fun ones. And then we have amoeboid protozoa, so flagellated, ciliated, and amoeboid. And so the phylogeny of anything that we call amoeboid is not known very well. A lot of lineages that have amoeboid cells in them, and then sometimes amoeboid cells may also be found in different shapes, like flagellated or something else, so it's just kind of a weird group. But when they're amoeboid, their cells have no definite shape, like this one up here. And they can change their shape. They crawl around using their pseudopodia. And so a pseudopod is literally false foot. And so all these lobes that stick out are their pseudopodia, and so when they're crawling, they just kind of like stretch their pseudopodia out, and then their cell contents kind of follow, and they just kind of change their shape as they're crawling around like a big blob. I think if you were like the size of this little dude down here, how terrifying that would be. Scary. Alright, mostly we find them in the benthos, but sometimes in plankton. And some of them produce what we call a test, which is basically a shell. I don't know where the word test came from. And this one down in this corner here, it looks kind of like a donut. I don't want a donut. But there's this brownish color is the shell, and then there's that opening, and so the cell's like inside of there, but it can stick pseudopodia out of that hole and crawl around with this like shell on its back. And I should have brought this picture, but when I was in grad school, I took a scanning electron microscopy class, and so we learned how to just prepare samples and stick stuff in the SEM, and so I took a sample out of the aquarium that was in our lab. And there was an amoeba that had made a test out of little tiny diatoms. It was really cool. Yeah, I'll have to bring a picture to show you. So that was kind of cool. Alright, have you heard of Naegleria? So that is the brain-eating amoeba. Have you heard of the brain-eating amoeba? So the brain-eating amoeba, Naegleria, lives in, it likes warm water, like really warm water, and it can, so it's called the brain-eating amoeba. So generally what happens is if someone who's swimming, that gets water up their nose, if there's Naegleria in that water, it will penetrate the skin in the nose, find an olfactory nerve, and crawl up to your brain. Cause a brain infection, which is 97% fatal. So we just don't have a good way to treat them. When we get diseases from eukaryotes, since our cells are eukaryotic and their cells are eukaryotic, we can't exploit differences like we do with bacteria, which are prokaryotes. So that's a problem, but also the whole like blood-brain barrier thing that I don't quite understand is probably part of the problem, but so that's an infection you definitely do not want to get. They have some medication that treats it, but it's still like usually it's 97% fail. So.
You're saying is all those times I swam in the nasty lake, I should have died a long time ago.
Well, it's just, I mean, if it's there, it could have, but if not, but like you often hear about it in tropical and warmer places like Louisiana or the Caribbean, something like that. So it's, yeah, the more you know, the scarier the world is. So, let's see, there we go. Alright, so that was our quick look at some heterotrophic protists. But they, even when we're looking just at algae, a lot of these critters show up. So now we're on to some different phyla of animals that are found in fresh water, but are not arthropods. Screw up, we'll do arthropods. So our first one, the phylum Porifera, what are those? Sponges. And we have freshwater sponges. You usually hear about marine sponges out of the ocean, and you can get some really big, crazy marine sponges. But we have some freshwater sponges. There's about 25 freshwater species in North America. And I've never seen any around here because they are filter feeders, and so water with a lot of sediment clogs them all up, and they don't like that. So we are not likely to see sponges in this area because we have such a sediment problem. But I have seen them out of lakes in northern Michigan, and a lot of them are this lovely green color, and that green color is from algal endosymbionts. So it's a green alga that lives inside the sponge, photosynthesizes, gives sugar to the sponge provides nutrients and a place to live, and so the sponge is then very green. Yeah, and that's green chlorella is just a green ball. It's very boring. Just a green ball, and that's usually the algal symbiont. And if we could come back in 20 million years, maybe some of these sponges would now be photosynthetic and have converted their symbiont into a chloroplast, but not in our lifetime. And then this bottom picture is an insect, the spongilla fly, and the larva is something that actually eats the sponge, which is one of the, there are not many predators of freshwater sponges, but that is one. And one of the reasons there's not a lot of predators on these sponges is that they have these silica spicules, or like little glass needles that make up part of their skeleton. If you think of like a natural sponge out of the ocean, they're squishy because they have spongin instead of glass spicules, so their skeletons are just squishier. But when you feel one of those, it feels like fiberglass kind of. It just feels kind of rough and weird. But anyway, so we have some freshwater sponges. We also have freshwater jellyfish. Did you know that?
No, there's a jellyfish that can turn back time on itself.
So what?
There's a jellyfish that can like revert back to its original birth state. It's weird. Like you can live for thousands of years by restarting over. It's weird.
Just like from polyp to
yeah.
Oh, wow.
And just redo the cycle.
There's some weird stuff out there. Okay, so Phyllonodaria, it's not just jellyfish. There's a little hydra down here, but these are little invertebrate predators that have cnidocytes. Do you remember what those are from 130? That deep in the brain. So stinging cells that are triggered by touch. So jellyfish have the tentacles, and they're covered with cnidocytes, and so a prey item swims through the little skinny tentacles that are hard to see. Those little stinging cells just automatically shoot a toxic barb into the skin, and it can cause paralysis, it can cause death depending on the jellyfish. And there's this little freshwater one, Craspidid that's native to China, that's become invasive all over the world. And it's a little little dude, and this one's about the size of a penny, but the largest size they get to is about an inch or about 2.5 centimeters. And they kind of like bloom almost like algae. They just show up in large numbers in lakes or rivers one year, and then you don't see them for years and years, and then they just show up one year, and then you don't see them. It's just kind of weird. I've never actually seen them in the wild, but they look like, so you could like see a bunch of these little tiny white things floating in the lake. And I think they travel on, they can travel on waterfowl pretty easily, especially that's the Medusa phase, the swimming phase. They have a polyp phase that I think can travel pretty well. We also have a lot of hydra, which is native, and they can be very small at about 1 millimeter to about 20 millimeters, or almost an inch long. Those would be pretty large. And their tentacles stick up, so their bottom part here attaches to a surface. They can actually move around, and their tentacles stick up, and they can reach out and grab things and sting them, and then they have a mouth opening at the base of their tentacles, and they'll stuff food in there, and you'll see like a huge piece of food in there that they'll digest and then spit out waste product. That's a little bit scary. They can asexually reproduce. They can make little baby hydras that just kind of bud off of one side. So it'd be like if you grew your own twin off of your shoulder that grew into an adult and fell off. It's just weird. And so they eat micro crustaceans, which Grubal will talk about. You know, copepods or cladocerans or water fleas. Little tiny crustaceans. They like to eat those. And some hydra, like this one, is green. It's got chlorella, the green ball, endosymbionts. Other hydra are just brown, and they don't have the endosymbionts. But hydra are pretty common. I wouldn't say they're abundant, although Dr. Blanchard was looking for salamander eggs one spring, and he was looking in these, like, we call them vernal pools, just like wet pools that are there from, like, in late winter, early spring. And he found this vernal pool out of Beach Ridge, and there were just a ton of hydra in there. Kind of weird. He brought some back, they're cute. But I we pull these out of Pacer Pond, not like all the time or super abundant, but they're out there. All right, and that Craspa decusta, here's where they have been spotted and considered invasive. So they, I guess, haven't been in Reelfoot at all, but they've been close. So they're found a lot of places in the U.S. and also all over the world. These maps are from the U.S. Geological Survey, and this is from 2019, but they've changed their maps, so I can't look these up anymore, but they have like interactive maps, which are kind of cool, and you can pull up species, invasive species. Right. Okay, our next phylum, it's a nice worm phylum, the Platyhelminthes. Remember what Platyhelminthes are?
Helminths?
Flatworms. So, helminth is worm, platy, or flat. So they're very, like, thin. They might be broad, but they're very thin. And there's a couple of classes I want to mention that are in freshwater. The free-living flatworms are the turbularians. There are some freshwater. There's also terrestrial turbularians. There's an invasive turbularian terrestrial that has been seen in the state, but it's a hammerhead worm. They're like that long, and they have like a weird head. But we have freshwater ones. what they do for a living, they're predators, scavengers, kind of omnivores. They just sort of eat whatever they can come across. And planaria is the most common one. If you remember looking at flatworms in 130 lab, it was planaria that you were looking at. They were under a dissecting scope and they had a little kind of arrowhead and cross-eyed, and they were kind of weird looking. They're fun. But I found these, like, if you pick up a rock in a stream and turn it over and see a little gray blob of snot, it's a flatworm. So they're around. I haven't seen a whole lot around here, but they are around. Microstomum is one that I see on slime TV sometimes because it is microscopic. You need a microscope to see it, but it looks huge in the microscope. It takes up like a couple of fields of view. But I see that pretty commonly. All right, so those are all free living. In freshwater, we have some flukes, which are parasitic. And this picture is something called swimmer's itch. Have you ever heard of that? Maybe not. This was a thing up north where at the University of Michigan Biological Station, it's on a lake. And swimmer's itch is a fluke, and a lot of parasites have multiple species in their life cycle, like fish and then ducks, or like snails and then humans. And the fluke that causes swimmer's itch, it wants to get into a type of duck called a merganser, which I don't know that do we have those here? I don't know if we have them. But they're kind of cool because they look like they have teeth because their bill is kind of serrated, but they're not actually teeth. And they have like a little crest on their head.
We do have mergansers, just not as abundant.
Okay.
We saw a couple in New Johnsonville.
Oh, okay.
So they're pretty neat.
So they are here. But swimmer's itch, it's a fluke that if you go out swimming, it thinks you're a merganser and it burrows into your skin, and that's how it would infect the merganser. But since we're not compatible, like we're not the host for that particular fluke, it'll die in your skin and then cause this inflammation where your body's trying to get rid of that foreign object, and it's itchy.
Kind of reminds me of chiggers.
Huh?
Kind of reminds me of chiggers.
Yeah, but chiggers don't actually bury themselves in you, which is it's a myth. It's a myth. Chiggers spit on your skin, and their saliva like dissolves your skin, and then they suck that up, and they're on you for like many hours, and so it takes many hours for them to do enough damage to get itchy. So if you've been outside and you're worried about chiggers, that night you should take a shower with like soap and washcloth and just rub everything, and that usually gets rid of them and you don't get as many bites. And if you're really serious, you could then, after your shower, get some rubbing alcohol and just rub it all over you and try to kill them. Which also gets off poison ivy. Anyway, I digress. So that's swimmer's itch, so that's unpleasant. What we typically do up there is just, if you can go swimming, but you should dry off really quickly and not hang out in your wet bathing suit. It's basically the prevention. There's a disease called schistosomiasis that's primarily tropical and developing country disease that's spread by a fluke, and humans are part of its life cycle, and also snails. And it tends to be passed around when there's bad sanitation because this is a really nasty parasite because it can infect all manner of your organs and organ systems. It tends to get passed around through feces and even urine maybe, so if there's bad sanitation, you've got like straight sewage going into a place where there's snails, then the part of the life cycle that comes out in human waste is the part that infects the snail, and then something happens in the snail, and then another part comes out of the snail, and then it burrows into your skin if you're in the water, and then travels to some other part of your body and infects it. So, pretty nasty, but it causes a lot of problems, especially people that keep getting like reinfected with it, and it's not good. But generally a problem where there's more tropical, bad sanitation, and they're trying to get, like, eradicate it. There's a medication that works pretty well, but it's still that's a problem. Alright, so that's a fluke. This phylum, we were chasing a gastrotrick, I think. I think that was us. Yep. So this phylum is another phylum of animals, and they're weird, not very speciose, only about 200 species, not studied very well. They're pretty distinctive looking. They have a head, so good for them. They've got a head, and as you can see their little bulbous head on that end. And another thing that indicates what they are is that they're just covered with all of these spines that are pretty long, so they look, it's not even hairy, it's just like spiny. And then they have these two little tails that stick out on the back end. So that look is fairly distinctive, and they swim through the water, and they like benthic habitats. One summer when I was at the field station, I took a class just on invertebrates, and we tried to collect gastrotrichs by putting out pieces of sponge and letting them hang out in the water for a few days. And actually I don't think we got any, or we got one or something like that. But I've seen gastrotrichs a lot in Pacer Pond, so they're there. But they like shallow water, and they swim around and feed on small cells like bacteria, protozoa, algae, or they might eat detritus from plants, etc. So much fun diversity. They are cute. Rotifers, also their own phylum. So these are like gastrotrichs and rotifers. These are multicellular animals with organs and organ systems. They're just really, really small, which I think is really cool. A lot more species of rotifers, about 2,000 species, mostly freshwater. And they have a distinctive crown or corona of cilia at the head area. And their mouth is on the top of their head, so their cilia, they use the cilia to create a vortex to suck food into their mouth. And they also use it for swimming. So we consider them filter feeders, because they are just kind of bringing in water and taking whatever they can get. And omnivorous, they'll eat whatever is around. And so they also eat a lot of bacteria. And they're really abundant. Pacer Pond has a ton of them. A lot of times if you don't see a lot of algae, you might see a lot of rotifers because they're just eating the crap out of the algae. Not the cyanobacteria, no one likes that, but if there's green algae or diatoms, you will be eating a lot of that. And then they themselves are a good food source for small crustaceans or insect larvae that Grubal will talk about. So they are a good food source. And fun fact, they reproduce mostly through parthenogenesis. You know what parthenogenesis is? It literally means virgin birth, and so females produce eggs that are clones of themselves. So you have diploid females that make diploid eggs that hatch into diploid females that are just clones of themselves. There's a few snakes that can do that sometimes. And they, if they want to make like a resting stage, then they might get stimulated to make males, which are haploid, and so they do the meiosis thing, and those eggs will hatch into males, which are usually smaller. and then, they'll go and fertilize females, and so those fertilized eggs might be developed into a resting stage that could just hang out for, like, over winter or something like that. But males are not, like, frequent. They're just every now and then, some males. And there's one group of rotifers called the Deloy rotifers, or the B and then a D, and they don't have any males, and so they just reproduce asexually, which is kind of wild.
So they're called parthenogenesis because sometimes they make males.
Yeah, parthenogenesis means virgin birth, so it's making females making eggs that hatch into females, and then the sexual part is like separate from the parthenogenesis.
So it just kind of sounds like asexual reproduction, but
Yep.
just in a funny way of doing it.
Yeah, so instead of like mitosis, it's making eggs. But yeah, like I forget which kind of snake, but there's a snake that was reported to, like, they found eggs that were parthenogenically produced and had viable females in them. So it's kind of interesting. Alright, that's rotifers. Another worm phylum, nematodes. Do you remember what kind of worms those are?
Nematodes.
Do you remember the common name? Roundworms? Yeah, that's what it was. Roundworms, about 2,000 freshwater species, and they are round. So Platyhelminthes, flatworms, flat. We'll talk about segmented worms like earthworms, which can shorten and lengthen, and nematodes. Their length never changes, and they flail about when they're swimming, and so they just like look like a little piece of thread that's just wiggling like crazy. So they're very small. They can be very abundant. Pretty much always see them out of an aquatic sample. They can also be abundant in soil. They're very common just in the world. And they may eat lots of different things: detritus, algae, aquatic plants. Some are carnivorous and might go after other nematodes. And there are a lot of parasitic nematodes. They've got a tough outer layer called a cuticle that makes them kind of resistant to a lot of immune systems. And they can be endoparasites on lots of different types of animals. Invertebrates can have nematode parasites, and vertebrates, including humans, can have nematode parasites, like the one that causes elephantiasis. You've heard of that? Causes lymphedema, basically swelling in the lower extremities. But there's a particular one connected to aquatic ecosystems, and this is again mostly tropical, mostly in Africa, but also some tropical parts of Asia, where there's black flies that are this insect larvae that are aquatic, and they get infected with this nematode, and then the adults bite vertebrates like humans, and we have black flies, but not river blindness up north, that when they bite you, they kind of anesthetize your skin, and then they use their mouth parts to like rip off a hunk of skin, and then there's also a little anticoagulant in their saliva, and so like the blood kind of pools up and they lick it up, and then when they're done they leave, and then you like sit there and kind of bleed a little bit after that, so it's kind of annoying, and then they're really itchy. Or they have river blindness. It can transmit the roundworm into the person, and then that can travel to various bodily organs, including the eye, and lead to blindness. So it can be kind of common in some places, and just it's bad. It's a baddie. All right. Moving on. So the mollusks, very large phylum. Let's talk about the gastropods, or the snails. I don't think we have any freshwater slugs but we have quite a few freshwater snails. And they are one of our big scrapers, and their mouth parts are described as a radula, which is kind of like this cheese grater that just scrapes surfaces. So they'll, and if you've seen a snail on the side of an aquarium, and you can like watch their little mouth going after algae growing on the wall of the aquarium, but they scrape surfaces. It could be a piece of wood, could be a rock, even sand, and they'll scrape away. And so they are important feeders of periphyton, and some studies have shown that the presence of snails can also stimulate periphyton. So basically snails will crawl around and kind of eat some algae, but they'll also poop, and that stimulates the algae. So there were some studies that found the presence of a grazer, actually we had more algae because the grazer was there than if the grazer wasn't there. So that's kind of weird. So there's that. So a lot of scraping, and they might scrape plants also, and just take layers off of plants. All right, more mollusks. We have the bivalves, the clams, and the mussels. And they generally burrow in sediments and filter feed. So usually like half of the clam will be in the sediment and the other half sticks up, and they've got their, they've got two little siphons, one that sucks in water, one that spits out water, and then filtration on the inside. And there's a group of mussels called the unionid mussels. And like, if you've ever seen like a really big clam out of somewhere, like one year in Eco Method, someone pulled a huge clam out of the ditch at real fit. It's like, dang, look at that thing. But that would be a unionid mussel. They usually use fish to disperse their larvae, so when they get reproductive, they'll just squirt out eggs and sperm into the water. Fertilized egg develops into a larva, then which infects the fish. I think it's usually in the gills, and then hangs and moves around with the fish, and eventually leaves and finds a new place to live. But a lot of unionids they live for a really long time, like decades, and so some of them are kind of vulnerable to human impact. And if you go visit Gruba in his office, he's got, they used to harvest mussels to make buttons out of them, and so he's got a mussel shell where you can see where the buttons have been punched out, just like perfect circles in the shell. But that was really decreasing the population size, so they became hard to find, and they quit doing that. All right, an invasive species, Corbicula, about the size of a quarter, is invasive. Came over from Asia, and it's basically every stream, almost everywhere. And it can be really abundant. And it's easy to recognize because this outer layer of its shell often flakes off, and you can see the white nacre underneath. And that can be really abundant. But I can't talk about mussels without talking about zebra mussels. They were such an invasive problem in the Great Lakes, and so, I'm short time here. Native to Eurasia, the Caspian Sea. They have a planktonic larva, so the unionids, they use fish. Zebra mussels, the larvae just swim in the water, and they're called veligers, and they were deposited into Lake St. Clair. I'll show you where that is in a second. In 1986, in ballast water and ships. So ships that are moving around the world, if they don't have enough of a load, they might take water into their hull to be heavier, so that the ship is at like the right level compared to the water level. And so if they have a small load, they might take in ballast water in one place, move across the globe, take on a bigger load, and then release all their ballast water to balance out. And so they can deliver organisms that way. Zebra mussels attach to hard surfaces, and they filter feed, and so they can attach to some of those unionid clams that are sticking out. They'll attach to rocks, to anything hard in the water like a dock or a ship or a shopping cart. And they initially, when they were found in densities like 100,000 to 300,000 per square meter, like that's a lot. And they're just all over. They're really sharp too, so if you were to go swimming like in the Great Lakes, you can't just run around without shoes, because if you walk on rocks and have zebra mussels, you're gonna cut the crap out of your feet. So, yeah, so they are been pretty gnarly invasion. Here's a map from 2023 of where they've been found. So Lake St. Clair, which you can barely see, is this, there's a little lake. There's the Detroit River here that connects Lake Erie with Lake Huron, and there's kind of a little bit bigger lake. Not big compared to Lake Erie or Lake Huron, but river, little tiny lake. So that's where it was first introduced, and it's spread all over. There's a buoy with a bunch of zebra mussels. Beaches now are like part sand, part zebra mussel shell. It's just, they're everywhere. So they've had a huge impact on the ecosystems, and here's a bunch of studies showing a bunch of crazy things that have happened because of them.
How do they form their shells?
What's that?
How do they form their shells? Do they just come naturally, or they just find an empty shell and...
No, they make them. Yeah, I think they absorb calcium from the water, and kind of like a snail makes their own shell, or they probably the mantle secretes it. There we go. That body part. You've got the foot, the visceral mass, and the mantle. The mantle's the outer covering, and that secretes the shell.
I didn't know snails make their own shells either.
Yeah, they do. We're running out of time. I'm gonna get kicked out. So, what do I want to say about annelids? So you can read all that. But there's earthworms that are aquatic. So oligochaetes are the earthworms, and they just kind of chew their way through sediment. They can be tolerant of low oxygen. Out west, there's this disease called whirling disease, which is actually a cnidarian, like the jellyfish group, that the annelids are a vector for it. And trout, they get this whirling disease. It gets into their brain, and they just swim in a circle until they die. And so it's not a good fish disease to have. So there's that. We also have leeches. They can be predators or parasites. We're used to thinking about parasites. We've got some little tiny leeches that are all over the place in Pincher Pond, but I've never found them on a person. I think they're little predators. They can be parasitic on vertebrates. Sorry about being so fast here. Bryozoans, ever seen a bryozoan? This mess. They're colonial, little tiny organisms. They make these big snot balls, and so these little colonies are just covering the surface. And they're often on a log, or they could be on a dock. They're pretty common at real foot. But they're really weird, and if you don't know what they are and you found one, you'd be like, what is this?
It kind of looks like coral in that zoomed in image.
Yeah, it does. It does. It's very similar. Similar kind of colony. Also known as dinosaur snot. Common in real foot. And then our last phylum, tardigrades or water bears. I've never collected in anywhere and they've been like, oh, it's full of water bears. That's never happened to me, but I've heard they can reach high densities. They like to hang out in the water between sand grains on the beach, so maybe not necessarily fully aquatic. They like to hang out on mosses, and they're pretty wild. They can be completely dried out and basically dead, but then they can get revived even years later. So they have this the most serious, I'm blanking on the word, dormancy. Like they have the most like lack of metabolism dormancy of all the animals. So they did experiments with them in space and stuff. Okay. And they have 8 legs and then 4 claws on each leg, which I think is so cute. Okay. So Gruba's gonna start, I don't know when he's gonna start Wednesday. I think he might be getting into the, we'll either do insects or he'll start with the